Hello and welcome or welcome back to another episode of Shoulders Down. In today's episode of the podcast, we're covering something very close to my heart and something that honestly changed my life when I learned about it. When I was 18 years old, I remember being at lunch at Mawa High School with my friends. They were eating bagels and sandwiches and regular food, and I was gnawing on raw tofu, spinach, berries, and hard-boiled eggs. Everyone praised me for being the healthy one, and I took pride in this identity. I even posted photos of my lunch Tupperware with a bunch of fruits and vegetables carefully arranged in rainbow order and put them on my Instagram. I was proud of this healthy persona. I liked being known as the girl who ate clean. Until, to my surprise, I learned that being hyper vigilant about nutrition, as I was, actually isn't very healthy at all. Everything changed for me when I learned the term orthorexia. Now, in this episode, we're going to talk about orthorexia nervosa, which is a form of disordered eating characterized by an unhealthy obsession with health. More specifically, we're going to cover what is orthorexia, how can healthy eating become unhealthy, what are the risk factors for developing orthorexia, the sneaky trap that is hiding behind the veil of health, and tips for healing from orthorexia. Now, not only is this something that I struggled with personally, but it's also something that I chose to devote my research time to when I was in my dietetic internship, which is the program you have to do after undergrad in order to become a registered dietitian. So I did my research for my final sort of capstone project on orthorexia, the risk factors, and looking at intuitive eating as an intervention for orthorexia. So all that to say is I got a lot of different experiences that make me qualified to speak on this topic. I've had the podcast for nearly 4 years, and we have not done an episode on this yet. I think a while back I had a guest who touched on her experience with orthorexia, but we haven't done this deep dive on what is orthorexia, what are the symptoms, what are ways that you can treat this, how can eating healthy become unhealthy? And that is exactly what we're going to do in today's episode. So to start, what is orthorexia? Orthorexia, or officially called orthorexia nervosa, is a form of disordered eating characterized by an obsessive focus on healthy or clean eating, and this focus causes rigidity, anxiety, and distress that interferes with the quality of a person's life. Now, the person who coined the term orthorexia is a alternative medicine practitioner by the name of Stephen Bratman, and what happened was he had a practice and people were coming in, and he started to notice that some people were so fixated on their diet and maintaining a certain level of quote unquote clean or healthy eating to the point where it was causing them distress and becoming unhealthy. So he coined this term and he defines orthorexia as preoccupation with buying, preparing, and consuming food believed to be healthy, which is not due to a culinary reason, but it stems from an overvalued idea about the health promoting and health damaging properties of certain foods or food groups. Orthorexia is a relatively new form of disordered eating. It was coined in the late 1990s by this man, Stephen Bratman, as I said, and it's not yet listed in the DSM, which is the official book of all different mental health diagnoses. And there are two main reasons for this. Bear with me for a second while we nerd out on why orthorexia is not in the DSM yet. The first reason is because there is no agreed upon diagnostic test. And part of the reason why it's hard to create a diagnostic test is because researchers have not been able to create a way of capturing the difference between an innocent interest in healthy eating versus a pathological fixation. There are several tests that currently exist, but there's no one universal recognized one. And part of the reason for this is because they're having trouble capturing that aspect of orthorexia of how do you distinguish between it being quote unquote innocent versus crossing the line into being pathological. Now, the other reason is because orthorexia is often co-occurring with other mental health diagnoses, such as things like anxiety and OCD. So researchers are still trying to determine whether or not it's a standalone diagnosis or if it's part of other conditions. regardless of the fact that orthorexia is not yet official in the sense that it's not listed in this like holy grail of mental health diagnoses. It is very much something that providers recognize and treat and that clients identify with. As I shared a little bit about at the start of this episode, in my own story, when I first learned about orthorexia, I felt so much relief knowing that I was not alone. The anxiety I was feeling around healthy eating was something recognized as problematic, so much so that there was this term to describe it. And I've seen the same for several of my clients. I actually just had a client call a couple of days ago where she learned this term for the first time and was really intrigued by it and definitely felt connected to some of the symptoms, which we'll get into in a second here. So, for folks with the symptoms consistent with orthorexia, they often really do feel relief knowing that there is a term explaining this, even if it's not official in the sense that it's not in the DSM. Now, if you want to get a little bit more into the different diagnostic tests that are out there, and why there isn't one universal one yet, I will link in the show notes to a webinar I gave as my sort of final project of my dietetic internship, and you're welcome to watch that. But warning, super nerdy, so be warned, but I think pretty interesting. So now that we have that background on orthorexia, let's talk about the symptoms. Maybe you clicked on this podcast episode because you just heard the term orthorexia, and maybe you did a little Google search and this podcast episode came up, and you're wondering if you have the symptoms consistent with this condition. So we're going to go through the symptoms one by one here. One of the first symptoms is obsessively checking nutrition labels and scrutinizing ingredient lists. This might look like standing in the grocery store aisle, comparing peanut butter labels, looking for the cleanest option. And, really this comes down to like splitting hairs between like, well, this one has this many grams of this, and this one has this many grams, and this one has two ingredients, but this one only has one. And people with the mindset of orthorexia often feel like the fewer the ingredients, the better. So obsessively checking nutrition labels and scrutinizing ingredient lists is one of the major symptoms. Another symptom is cutting out increasing numbers of foods or food groups. This might look like creating self-imposed restrictions like no refined sugar or no white flour or no dairy, no animal products, anything like this. Even something that might seem quite innocent at first, like going vegetarian, that can be a slippery slope, or it can be sort of a cover up that almost feels like a socially acceptable way to have a restriction without people questioning you and worrying that you're being restrictive or disordered. In my own story, I certainly went vegetarian, and I don't think I was like, I am doing this as a socially acceptable way to have a restriction. I just thought the more things that are off limits, the better, the more healthy I'll be eating here. And that was part of how I did that, was deciding just to go vegetarian. Another symptom is really interesting. I find this one probably is like the most interesting symptoms of all of them, and that is having an unusual interest in the health of what others are eating. This might look like analyzing or keeping tabs on or judging other people's food choices. Now, with this can come a feeling of superiority. You might be like, ooh, they're eating that. Well, I'm eating this. Feeling like you're morally above those who don't eat as quote unquote clean as you do. Now, I think that those symptoms, the unusual interest in what others are eating and the feeling of superiority, can be so uncomfortable because it feels yucky to be in that headspace of like kind of constantly monitoring, surveilling others and comparing what you're doing to other people and feeling superior to them. But the disordered mindset, this unhealthy obsession with health, can really take over and lead you to act in a way that isn't even aligned with your values, like judging other people, feeling superior to people because of your eating. And so if you resonate with that and you're like, oh, this feels so yucky, know that you're not alone. I have another episode called Did Diet Culture Hijack Your Values? And I talk a little bit more about this experience of feeling things that you're not proud of as part of being in a disordered relationship with food. So I will also link to that episode in the show notes if you want to go a little bit deeper on that. Another symptom is healthifying recipes instead of making them as intended. This might look like feeling uncomfortable making regular recipes for regular bread or baked goods or whatever, and instead making swaps for safer ingredients. So, some examples that come to mind, I think of instead of making the regular brownies with the flour, butter, sugar, you might feel like you have to make black bean brownies or chickpea cookies or something like this. Always feeling like you have to optimize whatever you're eating for the nutritional quality instead of allowing yourself to just enjoy a classic white flour, butter, sugar, brownie, or cookie, whatever. Another symptom is experiencing distress when foods deemed healthy are unavailable, and this might look like feeling stressed about travel because you might fear that there won't be enough healthy options available. It could also look like packing a bunch of your own food for travel, even if you're going somewhere where there's plenty of access to food, just because you don't trust that there'll be foods that meet your criteria for health and your self-imposed rules about what meets your criteria for health. And with this comes another symptom, which is bringing your own food to social events to maintain eating in alignment with health standards. This might look like packing a Tupperware of your quote unquote safe foods instead of joining in by eating the food being served at the event. That one really breaks my heart. I mean, of course, if you have a really serious allergy and you don't want to risk it and you don't want to go to an event without knowing you're going to have safe food to eat that isn't going to make you sick or go into anaphylactic shock, by all means, like that is not what we're talking about here. We're talking about bringing your Tupperware of steamed broccoli and plain bland chicken because you're too scared to eat the pizza or the pasta or the charcuterie or whatever is being served at the social event. Now, another symptom of orthorexia is social isolation. This could look like saying no to plans or trips or social events because of fear that you'll break your self-imposed rules for clean eating. That one really breaks my heart. And sometimes, like, you might be at the social event, but be kind of gnawing on your sad food in the corner and not feel a part of the event because, yeah, having shared food is part of feeling connected to the group. And also, if you're so in your head analyzing everything and battling yourself to not have one of the cookies or the chips or whatever being served there, that's going to make you unable to be present in the social setting. So, social isolation doesn't always look like just being alone in your room and not leaving your house and saying no to events. It could also look like going to the events, but feeling distant or feeling unable to be present because of how much food distress you're battling in your brain. Now, if you're not sure how to tell if you meet the criteria for these things, if these symptoms are going on in your life, a really good way to check in is to ask yourself, does my relationship with healthy eating get in the way of the quality of my life? That question can be hard to be honest with yourself about, and it's probably a little bit more of a complex answer than just yes or no, but it can be a really helpful starting point to figure out if this is something that is going on in your life. If your interest in quote unquote healthy eating is crossing the line into something more disordered or pathological. So now we're going to talk about the big question. To me, this is the core question with orthorexia, which is how can healthy eating become unhealthy? Such a good question, right? Like, how could it ever be bad? And sometimes you hear people say things like, well, at least I'm just addicted to healthy eating and I'm not addicted to something worse. And like, sure, you could be addicted to something worse, but there absolutely are very real harms to being obsessed with healthy eating. And this is because more isn't always more. Too much of even a good thing can become harmful. Think about drinking water. Drinking water is healthy, but it is possible to be overhydrated and to mess with the electrolyte balance in your body as a result, which can be very dangerous and even deathly. Think about exercise. Exercise is beneficial for the body. We know this, but too much can cause injury. You can think about taking supplements. Taking supplements can be helpful for people with different vitamin deficiencies, but at high levels, it can become toxic to the body. So more isn't always more. too much of a good thing can become harmful. And with food, a focus on nutrition can, of course, be positive, but it can quickly devolve into disordered eating. And that's the case in what's happening with orthorexia. Orthorexia can lead to inadequate energy intake, nutrient deficiencies, social isolation, high stress levels, and binge eating patterns. So we're going to go through these one by one to get more specific about how can healthy eating become unhealthy. The first thing that comes to mind, how can healthy eating become unhealthy? Well, it can result in nutrient deficiencies and inadequate energy intake. An over-obsession with health can lead a person to start limiting more and more foods and food groups from their diet. We know that variety is an important component to meet our body's nutrition needs. Removing types of foods or food groups, even things like gluten or processed foods or animal products, can impact a person's ability to get enough variety in their diet. Limiting entire food groups can also impact your ability to eat an adequate amount of food. So, as an example, say you're on a road trip and you're hungry, and you pull up to a gas station and you are so hungry, but all you're seeing is packaged foods and things that you deem unhealthy because they're quote unquote processed. You might say, you know what, there's nothing that meets my standards here. I'm just not going to eat, which can result in you not getting your body's needs for adequacy met, which means that you're not getting enough fuel. Your energy needs aren't being met. And the most important consideration when it comes to nutrition is adequacy. It doesn't matter how much kale and quinoa and superfoods and green juice you're eating. If you are not eating enough, it does not matter because your body will be in a stressed out state from not getting its energy needs met. In some cases, making certain foods or food groups off limits can even lead to nutrient deficiencies. So, for example, if you say something like, I don't allow foods with ingredients that I can't say or pronounce. This is a classic wellness culture rule, certainly one that I fell victim to when I was in my wellness culture practicing days. If this is a rule you subscribe to, you may end up avoiding products with enriched or fortified nutrients. So let's talk about this. From a public health perspective, the food industry fortifies and enriches certain products to help people avoid many different nutrient deficiencies. For example, many products that use flour, like cookies and crackers and bread, these products are often enriched with the B vitamins. And this is because products with flour in the refining process for getting the flour, often some nutrients are stripped from it. So, to prevent those nutrient deficiencies, often these products will have those nutrients enriched or fortified back in. So, the B vitamins are often the ones that are being put into food, into like these flour products, for example. But the scientific name for the B vitamins are words that would go into the category of things that you can't pronounce or ingredients that you don't recognize. Things like riboflavin, niacin, thiamine, folate. Riboflavin is B2. Niacin is, okay, this is me testing myself. I think niacin is B3. Thiamine is B1, folate maybe B5. I don't know. Someone can check me on that. But the point is, these are the B vitamins, and these are words that people might not recognize as like quote unquote whole ingredients. So, if you were avoiding foods with these types of ingredients, over time, you might develop a B vitamin deficiency. That's definitely a more extreme case, but it does happen. And in that research I did in my dietetic schooling, I looked at a case study of someone who did end up with serious nutrient deficiencies relating to orthorexia. So again, link to that YouTube video in the show notes. Beyond inadequate energy intake and nutrient deficiencies, over-obsession with health can lead to social isolation and increased stress levels. These are two factors that are known to have negative impacts on the body. So let's talk about social isolation first. I talk about this, I feel like, all the time on the podcast, but it's because it's so important. Connection and community are one of the social determinants of health, which is a group of factors that make up about 50% of the overall factors that determine our health outcomes. Folks who have strong social ties and a good sense of community are seen to have better health outcomes compared to folks who live more isolated lives. A great example, and one that I've talked about many, many times on this podcast, particularly in an episode called Five Studies That Will Change the Way You Think About Food, is the Rosetto effect. In the study, there's a community of Italian immigrants who were curiously found to have very low instances of heart disease, despite having diets that were very high in foods that we would normally associate with higher levels of heart disease, things like lard and red meats and alcohol. And so researchers were very curious what was going on here. And what they found was that this group of people were extremely close-knit, had incredibly strong social cohesion and community. And so it was ultimately determined that these close social relationships were what led the people to having low rates of heart disease in the community. Now, this research has been replicated in many different epidemiological studies, and it's now a known thing, a social determinant of health, that our social and community context plays a significant role as a predictor of our health outcomes. So, in this sense, staying home from the social event because the food doesn't meet your standard of health is probably more unhealthy than going and eating the pizza. Because social and community context, if you think about the Rosetto effect, it had a greater impact on the Italian immigrants' health community compared to the food they were eating. They were eating all the red meat and lard and butter and alcohol and those types of things, yet their health outcomes were so good because of their social determinants of health, like community context. I think that is so freaking cool. Like, to me, I hope that just helps take some of the pressure off of like, oh, like food is not the whole picture of health here. We don't have to hold it with such a white knuckle grip and obsess so much when actually that obsession could be impacting something that's more important, like our social and community context. Next thing we have to talk about is chronic stress. This is one of the great ironies of orthorexia. Orthorexia creates a situation where food is a trigger for stress. Every eating decision comes with thoughts like, is this healthy enough? What do the ingredients say? Is it non-GMO? Is it organic? Is it clean? What's it going to do to my body? If food is a trigger for stress, well, we have to make eating decisions multiple times a day, every single day. So, this can land you in a situation where your stress levels are chronically elevated because every eating decision, everything you buy at the grocery store comes with a little surge of stress of, oh no, like, what's the ingredients? What's this going to do to me? And just scrutinizing the label and all of that. And that ultimately can put you in a chronic stress state. And we know that chronic stress can lead to things like impaired digestion, disrupted sleep, increased inflammation, weakened immune system, anxiety, depression, and many other negative health outcomes. So the stress of fixating on perfect eating is not healthy. It leads you to being in this elevated stress state, which is directly connected with many negative health outcomes. Again, this is the greatest irony that is so often overlooked. This obsession with health ends up creating increased and unnecessary stress, really, then that stress leads to an unhealthy situation for your body. Okay, the next piece we have to talk about is binge eating. Orthorexia results in having lots of off limits or forbidden foods like cookies, candy, baked goods, packaged foods. And so when you limit foods or food groups, which if you've listened to this podcast for some time, you know this, restriction leads to fixation and binging. When you limit foods or food groups, it leads to this increased fixation, which can eventually result in that screw it moment. I can't take this anymore. I'm just gonna eat the food and binge my face off. For example, if you are a person in this kind of orthorexia mindset and you say ice cream is off limits, maybe you say like I'm allowed to have frozen banana blended up with something that's like the healthified ice cream, but regular good old Ben and Jerry's or Haagen-Dazs or whatever, if you make that off limits, it could lead you to put ice cream on a pedestal. Having foods on a pedestal can make them feel especially tempting, consuming your brain space. And it's common to get to a point where you just can't take it anymore and you end up eating the ice cream. And it's not because you're lacking discipline, it's because your brain is having a natural response to restriction. Now, when this happens, you'll likely be unable to stop at just a few scoops or even a bowl. This is because your brain is in that Last Supper mentality. It feels like this is my last chance to have real ice cream. I better get it all in now before I lose my chance, which then cues the binge eating. Binge eating can lead to high stress levels, guilt, shame, inhibited digestion, and body image distress, and it can also be physically very uncomfortable. On top of that, binge eating keeps you stuck in the cycle. Then you go, okay, well, I'm going to be really good and eat really clean starting tomorrow. And then you do that for a little and then you can't sustain it. And you go back to the binging, and that aggressive swing between those two extremes is really unhealthy for your digestion, for your metabolism. It can lead to weight cycling. It can create insulin resistance, which is a sort of precursor for diabetes. Bad news. Bad news all around. Whew, let me take a breath. I'm really getting heated about orthorexia here. So we talked about how an obsession with health can become unhealthy. Now we're going to talk about what are the risk factors for developing orthorexia. Again, this is something I deeply researched in my final project in my dietetic internship. And I think the risk factors are really interesting. Some of the risk factors for developing an unhealthy fixation on health include, first, we talked about this already a little bit, but pre-existing anxiety or OCD diagnosis. As we talked about, this can contribute to fear, obsession, and fixation. Also, having a high achieving or type A perfectionist type of personality can also predispose you to taking health from a kind of casual place to an extreme place. That's because like you always want to do everything to the most and max everything out and optimize. And as we're talking about, that can become dangerous. Now, another risk factor, no surprise here, but social media usage. Spending large amounts of time on social media, particularly looking at health and wellness content, can lead to becoming radicalized by the algorithm, which the algorithm might feed you increasingly extreme health protocols and influencers and trends and practices, which can shuttle you into this unhealthy obsession with health. Okay, this one I find really interesting. I have seen this to be true in the 100 plus clients I've worked with over the last 5, 6 years. People who have a perceived vulnerability to disease or a excessive fear of developing a disease are at a greater risk for developing orthorexia. What I mean by this is folks with a history of a disease in their family might feel like they have to be extra vigilant about healthy eating in order to try and prevent it. I've had clients where like a loved one died of cancer or a loved one had a heart attack in front of them or something, and that really scared my clients. And that led them to being like, I'm gonna take my diet so seriously so this doesn't happen to me, which is so valid. I think that, like, yeah, as humans, we try to find ways to feel in control. Having a family member suddenly get cancer or, drop dead of a heart attack or something, or just come down with an ailment out of nowhere, seemingly out of nowhere, it can feel really scary and make the world feel really unpredictable or remind us that, yeah, so many things in life are out of our control. So it's a really common and normal response to try and channel that fear into tightly controlling your diet and your health. That's twofold. One is seeing a loved one go through a health struggle, contributing to the increased fear. And the other is you yourself believing that you're at a greater risk, whether that's like because of something going on genetically or some other condition. Another risk factor for developing orthorexia is having a current or past eating disorder diagnosis. This one's also interesting to me, and it's definitely something I've seen in the work I've done with clients. Sometimes orthorexia is like a stop along the way from true recovery. So maybe someone says, oh, well, I no longer binge or purge or diet, but I now just eat healthy. So going from an obsession with calories and weight loss to an obsession with health can still be a form of eating disorder behaviors, just kind of like taking on a new shape, but it still can be quite disordered. And often people are like, well, it's better than what I was doing before. And I don't really know if that's true. I think it's maybe a positive thing that someone cares about their body and wants their body to be healthy and to heal from the abuse of calorie restriction or binge purge or, whatever it was, but it's still not thriving. It's surviving. It's not thriving and experiencing full peace and pleasure with food. So there's more work to be done on the recovery journey if you're in that place. Now, this one is interesting too. A risk factor for developing orthorexia is having a higher socioeconomic status. And this makes a ton of sense because it takes a lot of time, money, energy, and access to be able to even obsess over clean eating. People with more financial means are at more of a risk of developing orthorexia because they have the time to research nutrition, the money to afford quote unquote clean ingredients, and the access to health food stores and those types of things. Whereas folks who are either lower socioeconomic status or just like struggling to make ends meet in some way don't have the extra bandwidth or money to devote towards obsessing over clean eating. They're just like, yeah, like let's just eat food and move on. They might still have concerns and worries, but there isn't the space or the resources to let the interest in healthy eating get extreme. So those are the risk factors for developing orthorexia. To recap them, pre-existing anxiety or OCD diagnosis, social media usage, perceived vulnerability to disease or excessive fear of developing a disease, current or past eating disorder diagnosis, and being higher socioeconomic status. So now that we talked about the risk factors, I want to talk about this question of, are you hiding behind the veil of health? As Christy Harrison writes about in her book, which she was a former guest on this podcast, and we talked a lot about hiding behind the veil of health, the wellness trap, and I will link to that episode in the show notes. As she writes about in her book, The Wellness Trap, often the pursuit of wellness is actually just another form of dieting in disguise. Diet culture is always changing form. When people started catching on to the idea that traditional diets like Weight Watchers and Optivia and Atkins and Nutrisystem, that those types of diets were not working, diet culture shifted to remain relevant. And the shift that diet culture made was the whole, well, it's not a diet, it's a lifestyle. It's not about weight, it's about health. And this is the kind of thing that wellness plans claim. But these approaches that leverage the idea of focusing on health and not weight, they still have the underlying characteristics of a diet. There are still right and wrong foods. There are still morality attached to foods. It's still the case that, there are still right and wrong foods, with the right foods being the ones with few ingredients, the least processed, organic, non-GMO, no added sugar, and the bad foods being everything else. There's also still morality built in. You're good if you eat this way, you're bad or wrong if you eat this way. And like there's still low-key a message of like, this is actually also about weight. It's actually like we say it's about health, but it's kind of still about weight because all the influencers and the people talking about health are promoting these things and living in thin bodies. So there's still that like aspirational idea baked into the wellness marketing. And they can try to tell us that it's not a diet, but your body doesn't know the difference between calorie counting and eating clean. It just registers restriction as restriction no matter how you spin it or what you call it. And often, as I said, even when we tell ourselves it isn't about weight, often it really is. And a way to check in and get really honest about this is to ask yourself if you ate all the clean foods and never lost weight or even gained weight, would that be okay for you? This question will help you determine where your motivation really comes from. Okay, so to finish up here, we're going to talk about how do you heal from orthorexia? How do you move past this intense fear of foods that you don't perceive as healthy? If you have been resonating with this episode so far and you're aware that your relationship with healthy eating might actually be unhealthy, you're probably wondering, where do I go from here? Now, healing from disordered eating in any form, orthorexia included, is nuanced, and often the best route is to seek out individualized one-to-one support. But if you're looking for some tools to start with, here's what I've got for you. First, I recommend exploring the intuitive eating framework. Now, as I said, my research for my dietetic internship looked at the efficacy of intuitive eating as an intervention for orthorexia. And you don't have to watch the whole nerdy presentation to know that it is a very viable intervention for orthorexia with a lot of research backing that approach to healing from orthorexia. And this is because intuitive eating has been shown to lower food stress and stress levels in general, to improve mental health, increase your connection to your body cues, People who practice intuitive eating report greater life satisfaction and happiness, and are even seen to have improved biomarkers of health, such as lower cholesterol and blood pressure markers. Now, if you've been listening to this podcast, you probably know about intuitive eating because here I am, an intuitive eating dietitian, talks about the intuitive eating framework in so many of these episodes. But if somehow this is your first exposure to intuitive eating, or even if it's not, and you just want a nice overview on what is intuitive eating, we have a couple episodes I'd recommend. One is 10 Principles of Intuitive Eating in 10 Minutes. One is Intuitive Eating for Beginners. And I think those are the two main ones that would be good to start with. That is my first tip for you. The second thing I would recommend in healing from orthorexia is to familiarize yourself with the factors that actually contribute to your health outcomes. Diet plays a much smaller role than we've been led to believe. And realizing that there's so many other factors, it's not just diet and exercise, can help to take some of the pressure off clean eating because you start to realize that focusing so tightly on what you're eating is like splitting hairs in the grand scheme of things. Okay, my third tip for you is you can unfollow any wellness blogs, influencers, or other content that feeds into the fixation on healthy eating and feeds into this increased stress and worry about the health of your diet. The more information we have, the more obsessive we can get. Unsubscribing and unfollowing this type of content can help you quiet outside noise and practice leaning into your body's wisdom instead. Now, tip number 4 is to flip the focus. Instead of thinking about how a food is supposedly going to harm you, challenge yourself to think about what the food has to offer you. Orthorexia is very fear-based, like this food is bad because of this and it's going to do this to me. Instead, flip it to think of what does this food have to offer my body? And all foods have something to offer the body, even processed foods, even foods like cookies and chips and candy and ice cream. When you focus on how a food is supposedly harming you, you activate the sympathetic nervous system and your body goes into a stressed out state. When you focus on what the food has to offer your body, you're priming your body to absorb the maximum amount of nutrients from that food and for optimal digestion and metabolism. And you're putting yourself in a parasympathetic state, which is putting your body in the ideal state for rest and digestion and, like I said, nutrient absorption. I have another episode on this concept in and of itself. It's so interesting. I think it's something like your relationship with food impacts your digestion and metabolism or something. I will also link to that one in the show notes. Okay, tip number 5. Instead of a rigid relationship with nutrition, focus on gentle nutrition. This is a flexible approach to nutrition in alignment with the intuitive eating framework. This relaxed approach to health encourages you to think about nutrition from a place of self-care, not self-control. And it encourages you to think about nutrition from a place of how do I want to feel instead of what do I want to look like? What kind of personality do I want to be known as? Instead of it being this like performative thing, it encourages you to focus on how do you actually want to feel in your body. And it's very, very powerful. Now, lastly, number 6, super important, and that is to address underlying issues with a therapist or mental health professional. If you are someone who navigates anxiety or OCD or perfectionism, and or maybe you identify as a high achiever or type A, it might be supportive to seek out the help of a mental health counselor. And this is because if those issues go unaddressed, you're at a greater risk of channeling the need for control into your eating, which can develop into something like orthorexia or another eating disorder. Okay, so we covered a lot in this episode. If this is your first time hearing about orthorexia, there's a lot to sit with and to take in. Even if it's not your first time hearing about orthorexia, a lot of maybe new information here. What I want to leave you with is that we don't do things for no good reason. Our bodies are really, really smart. And if we develop a disordered relationship with food or a fixation on health, there's a reason we're doing that. An obsession with health often develops out of some desire for control or safety. Again, as I said earlier, working with a professional to unpack why you're seeking safety and control and how you can get those needs met in a sustainable, non-disordered way can be a really helpful starting point and also a really important way to access self-compassion of like, oh, something has happened in my life that's made me feel like I need to control my eating. I'm doing this for a reason. I'm not messed up. There's nothing wrong with me. I'm trying to cope. This is my body just trying to protect me and keep me safe and do its job coping. So that is all for today's episode. If you want support, if you feel like you struggle with an unhealthy obsession with health, I would love to work with you. This is one of my specialties. As I said, I have the personal experience with orthorexia, and I also have the professional background where this was a research area of focus for me in my dietetic internship. So I would be honored to support you along your journey in healing from these orthorexia like symptoms so you can step into your most aligned, fulfilling, pleasurable, peaceful life. That is all for today's episode. Thank you so much for being here, and I will chat with you in our next episode.